Grazie mille dell'invito.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the five-star movement that has invited me to Brussels. I'm delighted to be here. So very briefly, because I want to leave time for questions, I want to specify why I'm always so harsh when it comes to the EU. I speak very frankly, and I qualify it as a dictatorship because the EU is a new form of totalitarianism, different to what we saw in the past. However, what it has in common is all the key elements, including the fact that it has the strong desire to give itself legitimacy through a legal structure. In fact, any technical expert or lawyer who looks closely at the European treaties can immediately understand there's something wrong, that there was a predefined objective right from the start. So let's have a look at some of the provisions briefly. First of all, what does totalitarianism actually mean, or what demonstrates it? The fact that the Parliament has taken out many of the rights that you usually have in a democracy. The Parliament is the place where legislation takes place via debate between different people, different movements and different ideas, elected on a very clear basis, namely popular sovereignty. So it's the European peoples that should be electing a parliament that should have specific legislative functions and not act as a deferred notary. That's what the parliament does. And what's lacking is the key legislative factor of right of initiative. Article 17 of the Treaty on the Function of the EU is perfectly clear here because it sets out legislative initiative at the behest of the European Commission. So the European Commission is not flowing directly from sovereignty. It's therefore removing lawmaking from the people, from the electorate. And what is even worse is that the doctrine of legislative independence from politics is no longer there, because in Article 17 there is a ban on the Commission taking advice from the Member States or the European Parliament. So the Commission cannot take any advice from the people, from democracies, from those who are electing the members of parliament. This is the characteristic that is the preserve of totalitarianism. In Italy, we had fascism, which then led us to the Second World War. So what is the main characteristic of fascism? Namely, that the power of the parliament is subordinate to the executive power. So effectively it removes the people from the decision-making power. This characteristic has been strongly countered by the Italian constitution that put the parliament at the centre in terms of its activity, and there is a ban on the executive taking on any the power of the legislative. And that's not because there was a problem of governance, but rather the idea was that people should be represented in a chamber proportionately, and that should then express democratic will. So, first of all, for that reason, we can say that the EU is totalitarian, because people do not decide. Secondly, let's try to understand what kind of totalitarianism we're talking about. Once again, we're very far from what we saw in history, where totalitarianism was associated with nationalism, where a state wishes to impose its power at international level as well, its dominion. Europe is different. We could call it financial totalitarianism. So that's something new in terms of legal structure. And here again, I could use a few provisions of the treaties to illustrate this. There are just a few articles that show this concept. For example, Article 127 of the Treaty on the Function of the EU, which governs the European system of central banks, headed up by the ECB, gives a very clear objective to the ECBs and the system's policy. It says, first and foremost, price stability. This morning in the economic part, we heard what that means. But then it says something even more important in terms of destroying democracy. It says that price stability predominates over the Article 3 of the TFEU. So let's have a look at what those objectives are. If we look at that provision, we can see that those objectives are peace and the well-being of people, which, according to the treaty, are subordinated to price stability. So peace comes after price stability. The well-being of people comes after price stability. Ladies and gentlemen, these are laws that have been codified in this way. It's Europe that has given rise to them, and this is something that is very serious and very far away from the true nature of a democracy. And then another point which characterizes a financial dictatorship. What are we basing ourselves on? What's the value of Europe in economic terms? Competitiveness. What does that mean? If within a particular area or a setup, and here Europe that we'd like to see free and at peace, if we're fighting against one another, so if Italy's success has to go through the suffering of another state, that cannot work. So a national constitutional model, in Article 2, it talks about political, economic and social solidarity, and that model is diametrically opposed to competitiveness. If we allow unbridled competition in a market where the state is outside because it no longer has any powers of control over the economic sector, in other words, there's no room for democracy there, then we are entering a system with no democratic controls where there'll be one winner. And in fact, what we've seen in so-called neoliberal policies, we've seen the distribution of wealth over the years going to a very small percentage. There's a small percentage, 1% holding 99% of global wealth. And this is the model that's been enshrined in the treaties. And then we might wonder, is this a model that is no longer in line with the original thinking of the founding fathers? I'm talking about Rossi, Spinelli from the 28 group. If we read the fourth paragraph of their manifesto, we can see something very different to the usual story we hear. We see things such as the following three examples. 1, the people have some basic needs that need to be satisfied. However, they don't know exactly what they want or what they want to do. That's a very serious sentence where the importance of popular sovereignty is undervalued and people are considered not at the level of democracy, whereas in fact they should be on an equal footing with it. So that's a terrible sentence. What's even worse in paragraph 4 is that it says, in the revolutionary period, democratic practice fails resoundingly. Now, with the revolutionary period, we can understand the start-up of the European Union, where there's no room for democracy. And you, as members, you experience that on a day-to-day basis when you realize you're helpless in the face of decisions that are handed down by economic powers. In fact, you have very little room for maneuver. And to conclude, I think this might be one of the worst sentences in the manifesto that no one ever remembers. Democrats do not refuse violence per se, but they only want to use it if the majority is in favor of its necessity. These are only to be used in an exceptional situation. Well, I don't know if that is really... I don't know if what we're seeing today is in the spirit of this original manifesto, and I do think we need to think about it very seriously because it has huge impacts. Turning back to the economic model, what did our founding fathers say? And I'd like to pay tribute to the Italian system. Given the situation we were in at the end of the Second World War, we'd had a dictatorship that led us to war, and we'd been razed to the ground. So when the Constitution was written in 1948, all attention was given to democracy and the highest human values. And with that in mind, our founding fathers were quite sure of the fact that it was neoliberal economic policy that had caused nationalisms that then led to war, and that Aldo Moro and Ghidini both said that it was necessary for the state to intervene to control, discipline and coordinate the economic sector. That doesn't mean communism. It just means that democracy can intervene to steer the economy and to put an end to this kind of situation. And the last point, as I wrap up, is how this dictatorship that we now see intends to increase its powers via lawmaking. Well, this is the euro. As we heard from Professor Sapir this morning, the euro, which has led to an abandonment of sovereignty of economic and monetary policy on the part of the member states, has imposed constraints. It's meant that a state no longer has its currency. That's fundamental. People's sovereignty and currency. Well, then a state that no longer has a currency is no longer a state, so it is subject to blackmail by the economic powers that be. And as we heard from the founding fathers, that if the economy is allowed to prevail with no politics, it gets out of control. And during the war, we were occupied by troops, and today we're being occupied by the Maastricht Protocol, Protocol 12, the Stability and Growth Pact, the 3%, and the lack of monetary freedom where we cannot finance our state. All that can happen is that the state keeps taking on deficits and will at some point disappear. So we see the euro as the army in a dictatorship. What can we do? We have to reform the system. We have to destroy this system and come back and talk about it as sovereign people, respecting political, economic and social solidarity. Thank you.